Welcome to the Deep Dive, your essential shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we're not just analyzing philosophy, we're really cracking open a legal codex, one designed by arguably the greatest philosopher of the classical world.
That's right.
We're diving deep into the monumental project that occupied Plato in his final years, the Laws.
And it's such a fascinating work because it shows this huge evolution in Plato's thinking, doesn't it?
Definitely.
I mean, you look at his earlier work, The Republic, and you see this, this radical, often criticized utopian idea, right? Philosopher kings, no written laws needed.
Which sounds great in theory, maybe?
But the Laws is almost the complete opposite. It's Plato getting really practical. He's moving beyond that pure idealism.
So this is him trying to design something that could actually work.
Exactly. He's laying out a comprehensive, super detailed legal code for a real-world city. The goal is stability, a system where justice is rooted firmly in, reason, virtue, and this is key, the rule's law, written law.
Okay, and to really grasp what Plato was up against, I mean, the sheer difficulty of designing a flawless system, we have to understand the flawed systems he was looking at, the ones he was reacting to.
Absolutely. Our source material today is fantastic for this. We've got detailed histories, stuff on Greek and Roman law-giving, constitutional design. It really sets the stage.
So what's our mission here? What are we trying to uncover by looking at these older systems?
Well, our mission is really to explore the foundational questions that Plato himself was grappling with. Questions like, how do you actually structure a government to manage power effectively, without it turning into tyranny on one hand or just chaos on the other?
Right, the perennial problem.
And also, what does it really mean to be a virtuous citizen? Can laws actually make people good or just obedient?
That's a huge one, especially for Plato.
And finally, how do legal systems even enforce these high ideals when they run smack into, social hierarchies, plain old self-interest, and that human tendency to choose what's profitable over what's maybe noble or pious?
Okay, so we're essentially looking at the challenges Plato saw by dissecting the constitutional models that came before him, the ones that failed, or maybe only partially succeeded.
Precisely. We're looking at the context, the precedents, the problems he was trying to solve with the laws.
All right, let's unpack this blueprint for power then, starting with the basic structure, the constitutional foundations. The ancient world, especially the Greek city-states, they spent centuries basically experimenting with governance, right? Always trying to manage that threat of unchecked authority.
Constant experimentation.
And we've got two perfect Greek contrasts to look at. Sparta rigid, dual kingship, kind of unique, and then Athens, which evolved into this really dynamic, sometimes messy democracy.
And what jumps out immediately is that these ancient lawgivers, they absolutely understood that you needed checks and balances. That wasn't really up for debate.
Right, it was a given.
But how they achieved them? Radically different approaches, often conflicting mechanisms. Take Sparta, for example. Plato studied Sparta very closely.
He was quite interested in them, wasn't he?
Oh, very. And the most characteristic and arguably the most powerful part of their whole political setup was the ephorate, this council of 5 overseers.
5 overseers. And these guys eventually became more powerful than the kings, didn't they? How did that happen?
Yeah.
And why 5?
Good questions. The number 5, the sources suggest it's basically territorial. It seems linked to the union of the 5 original demes, or villages, that came together to form the city of Sparta. So it's like a ground-up representation.
Okay, built from the foundations of the city itself.
Right. But their political clout wasn't there from day one. It looks like it grew out of a specific historical moment, maybe back in the 8th century BC. This was likely when the hereditary kings, who were the traditional heads of state, had to give up their civil jurisdiction.
Ah, so they kept the military command.
Kept the military leadership, yes, but the day-to-day running of the city, the civil justice system, that seems to have shifted to these 5 ephors.
So the ephors weren't just filling an administrative void, they actually became the formal legal check on the king's inherited power.
Exactly. They gained enormous political power during what our sources call an acute conflict. This was a major clash between the nobility, represented by the kings, and the ordinary Spartan people, who felt they didn't really have a voice in the traditional government structure.
So the ephors became the champions of the people, in a way.
Pretty much. They represented the popular cause, the voice of the non-elite Spartans. And the way they resolved that political struggle, the compromise they reached, it was brilliantly simple but constitutionally groundbreaking. It's all captured in these monthly oaths they exchanged.
The monthly oaths, right. You mentioned those. That sounds less like a final resolution and more like a system designed for ongoing tension. What did the oaths actually say?
Well, it was basically a system of conditional loyalty, which is quite revolutionary when you think about managing inherited power like kingship. The king would swear an oath to uphold the laws of Sparta, the laws supposedly handed down from the legendary Lycurgus, and in return, the ephor would swear to maintain the king's royal power, but, and this is the crucial part, only so long as the king kept his oath.
Wow. So if the king broke the laws,
Then the ephor's loyalty was theoretically dissolved. This ceremony wasn't just symbolic, it embedded political accountability right at the top. It meant the monarchy had to operate under the constant threat of legal challenge from the people's representatives.
that really paints a different picture of Sparta. Less monolithic, more balanced by internal checks. And the ephor itself, wasn't it supposed to be quite democratic in how its members were chosen?
In theory, yes. Any full Spartan citizen could be elected an ephor. Now, the way they were elected, that was a bit controversial even back then. Aristotle famously called the method very childish.
Childish.
It seems to have functioned basically like an election by shouting or acclamation, or perhaps even by lot, which meant, yes, it was open to the common citizen, very democratic in that sense, but maybe it didn't always guarantee the most qualified or experienced person got the job.
A potential downside to pure democracy, maybe?
Perhaps. But once elected, their power was significant. They acted as the supreme judges, in many cases, and their oversight of the two kings was total. They had the power to indict a king, summon him for questioning.
And they even went on military campaigns with them.
Yes, two ephors always accompanied a king on campaign. That ensured continuous scrutiny, made sure the king didn't overstep his authority while away commanding the army, and crucially prevented him from trying to, say, usurp legislative power while he had troops at his back.
Okay, so the kings were checked by the ephors, who represented the people. But did the system have a check on the people's power too? On the assembly?
It absolutely did. And this is a critical point, something Plato would have paid close attention to. Even decisions made by the main Spartan assembly, the Apella, weren't automatically final.
Really, who could stop them?
The Gerousia, the Council of Elders, a more aristocratic body, and the magistrates, including the ephors themselves, had a kind of veto power. If they didn't approve of what the assembly decided, they could effectively nullify the proceedings.
How? Just say no.
Pretty much. They would simply refuse to proclaim the decision as valid. The sources describe it as them choosing to secede and dissolve the meeting.
That's fascinating. It's like an early form of constitutional review against maybe populist impulses.
You could see it that way. It built in a structural break, ensuring that the more conservative, experienced element, the elders, the magistrates, could prevent potentially rash or short-sighted decisions by the broader assembly.
So the whole Spartan system was designed for stability, maybe even sluggishness, prioritizing tradition over rapid change.
Exactly. It was a deliberately balanced, if complex, structure. A key lesson, no doubt, for Plato as he thought about his own mixed constitution in the laws.
Okay, so that's Sparta. Maintaining kingship, but hedging it about with serious checks. Athens, though, took a completely different route. They got rid of their kings much earlier.
That's the big contrast. Athens moved away from traditional hereditary kingship much sooner than most other Greek states. Now, they never totally abolished the name king. There was always an official called the Archon Basileus, the king Archon, right up until the end of Athenian democracy. But his role became mostly ceremonial, usually religious duties. The real governing power shifted elsewhere.
To the archons, these were aristocratic chiefs.
Exactly. They became the chiefs of an aristocracy. So Athens went from monarchy not directly to democracy, but through a significant period of aristocratic rule first.
And this transition, it wasn't just a palace coup. It involved restructuring the state.
Yes. Tradition credits a family called the Medontids with kind of engineering this. They systematically stripped the old kings of their real power, leaving just the title, the shadow of royalty. But the really big constitutional move associated with this era was the Synocism.
Synocism, that's the political unification of Attica, the region around Athens.
Right. Bringing together the scattered towns and villages of Attica into a single political entity. This wasn't just about drawing lines on a map. It was a constitutional revolution.
How did unifying the territory necessitate a whole new organization?
Well, it centralized everything: military command, judicial power, political decision-making. It took people who were previously maybe just villagers in Attica and made them all Athenians in a single unified state.
Created a common citizenship.
Precisely. And this new, larger, centralized state needed structure. So they borrowed a system, apparently from the city of Miletus, and organized all the inhabitants into 4 tribes: the Geliantes, Argidaeus, Aegacuris, and Hoplites. Each tribe had a tribe king, a Philobacillus, at its head.
So this tribal system was the framework for the early aristocratic government.
It seems so. It helped consolidate aristocratic control initially, define the political body, and set the stage for the later reforms of Solon and Cleisthenes, which would eventually push Athens towards democracy.
Okay, so the Greeks are wrestling with these structures of power, kings versus ephors, aristocrats versus the people, this kind of horizontal conflict. But the Romans, when they faced their big internal conflicts, they turned to something else, writing it all down, codification.
Exactly. The Roman foundation story, legally speaking, is the Law of the 12 Tables. And its very existence is owed directly to what they called the struggle of the orders.
This was the conflict between the patricians and the plebeians.
Right, a vertical conflict. You had the aristocratic patricians, who initially held all the power, all the religious offices, and crucially, they knew the unwritten laws. And then you had the plebeians, the non-aristocrats, who were often exploited because the law wasn't public. Patrician magistrates could interpret it however they wanted.
So demanding written law wasn't just about knowing the rules. It was a fight for transparency, for legal equality.
Absolutely fundamental. The big push came in 462 BC when a tribune of the plebs, Gaius Terentilius Harsa, demanded that the powers of the consuls, the top magistrates, be defined and written down.
And that led to the 12 Tables.
It did. After a lot of political struggle, they eventually appointed a special committee of 10, the Decemviri Legibus Scribundus, 10 men for writing the laws. They supposedly studied Greek laws, including Solon's laws in Athens, and then published the first 10 tables in 451 BC and the final 2 a year later in 450.
And crucially, this powerful committee, they didn't just impose the laws, did they?
No, and this is very Roman. Even though the Decemvirs had been given supreme power, imperium, to create the laws, the sources emphasize that they still sought popular ratification.
Why, if they had the authority?
Because of a deep-seated Roman idea about legitimacy. The Law of the 12 Tables was formally confirmed by the Comitia Centuriata, the main Roman assembly, organized by wealth and military class. Even if technically the Decemvirs could have just decreed it, pushing power to its absolute limit like that was seen as, well, unseemly, even dangerous.
So getting popular buy-in, even if it was filtered through a structured assembly, was essential for the law to be accepted.
Essential for its long-term authority. It grounded the law in the consent of the governed, or at least a form of it. That commitment was there early on in Rome. It wasn't just about what the law said, but who agreed to it.
Okay, that gives us the constitutional scaffolding, the structures designed to manage power and conflict that Plato was looking at. But Plato, especially in the laws, he wasn't just interested in order. He had this deeper goal. He wanted his laws to actively cultivate virtue, goodness, in the citizens themselves.
That's the driving ambition of the work.
So we need to shift focus now from the sort of engineering of government to the engineering of the soul, you could say. How did Plato think law could achieve that?
Well, his whole approach in the laws was incredibly ambitious. He saw the entire legal code as a tool for moral education, not just the punishments, but even the preambles he wrote for the laws. These were meant to persuade citizens of the law's moral rightness, not just command obedience.
Persuasion, not just coercion.
Exactly. But he was also reacting to the reality that existing laws often completely failed to legislate morality effectively. Sometimes they even created impossible moral conflicts.
And the classic example here is Draco's homicide law in Athens.
Right.
One of the oldest laws we actually have text for.
Yes, Draco's law, probably from the late 7th century BC. It's fascinating because it's deeply tangled up with religious duty, with piety. The law didn't just allow, it actually presumed and legally required the victim's relatives to act.
To seek vengeance.
Yes. Vengeance was seen as a public necessity, a religious obligation to appease the ghost of the murdered person, as much as it was a legal right for the family. The duty fell squarely on the surviving kin.
Okay, but what happens when the killer is kin? When the murder happens within the family?
Now you've hit the core problem. That scenario created a profound moral dilemma. If your cousin killed your brother, for example, you were faced with 2 conflicting, deeply held cultural mandates.
Piety versus family loyalty.
Precisely. Piety demanded you pursue vengeance against the killer to honor your dead brother's spirit. But family solidarity, the need to protect the integrity and reputation of your kin group, your genos, pulled you in the opposite direction. Prosecuting your own cousin could destroy the family.
So what usually happened? Which principle won out?
The evidence we get from hints in the speeches of orators and even references in Plato himself strongly suggests that, in practice, family solidarity generally won out.
People protected their own, even against the demands of law and religion.
It seems so. And that's a critical insight for someone like Plato, trying to design a comprehensive legal system. It starkly highlights the limits of law. A public mandate, however strong, couldn't always override these fundamental, private, almost biological obligations of kinship and self-preservation.
It exposed the failure of law to compel an action that went against people's deepest social instincts.
Right. And it showed Plato that just telling people what to do, even invoking the gods, wasn't enough. Coercion alone is insufficient. You need to shape the underlying character.
And there was also a suggestion that Draco's law might have had a political subtext.
Yes, some scholars read certain features of Draco's law, particularly its focus on individual liability and its potential retroactivity, as possibly being an indirect critique of how things were handled politically before. Specifically, the way the powerful Alcmaeonid family was judged and cursed after the Cylonian affair, where a political massacre was sort of dressed up in religious and legal formality.
So law wasn't always a neutral instrument of justice. It could be a weapon in political feuds.
Absolutely. Which brings us right back to the state's role, as Plato saw it, in shaping the moral capacity of its citizens. If law can be corrupted, then the character of the people becomes even more crucial. For Plato, the law must be fundamentally instructional. The state's highest duty is the virtue of its people.
And we see this idea echoed by others too, right? Like Socrates.
Yes. Xenophon tells that story where Socrates is defending himself against accusations, and he says something like, he never stops showing people what justice is through his actions, his deeds, even more than his words. It's about demonstrating goodness, embodying it.
Living the example.
Exactly. And you hear similar ideas from the orator Aeschines. He often argued that a boy who was well brought up, properly educated, would naturally be useful to the city. He believed the city's laws actually improved a person's innate nature, making it better than it was initially.
So law as a refining agent for character.
That's the ideal. And the ultimate philosophical benchmark for this refined character, you find it clearly stated in Aristotle. He says that goodness and the good person are always the measure of the facts.
What does that mean exactly? The good person is the measure.
It means the virtuous person sees things clearly, is internally consistent. They're always in agreement with themselves because their actions align with their rational understanding of the good. They act for their own sake, which for Aristotle means acting for the sake of their reasoning part, their intellect. This is that ideal of inner harmony and self-governance that Plato desperately wanted his laws to foster.
He wanted laws so clear, so rational, so persuasive in their preambles that citizens would internalize them and genuinely want to be virtuous, not just follow rules out of fear.
That's the dream, the theoretical ideal.
Okay, but then there's the brick wall of human reality, which Aristotle himself nailed, didn't he, that phrase?
Yeah, the classic. All men, or most men, wish what is noble but choose what is profitable.
Ouch. That tension, the noble versus the profitable. That must have been a constant headache for any ancient lawgiver, especially in a place like Athens.
Absolutely chronic. Athenian democratic ideology loved to claim that good citizenship was a win-win, right? What's good for the city is good for you. What's good for you is good for the city. A perfect harmony.
Sounds nice.
Sounds lovely. But the reality on the ground was this constant temptation towards, well, shrewd, self-serving behavior, finding ways to dodge your civic duties if you could get away with it.
And what were the main duties people tried to dodge? Where did profitable most often win out over noble?
Well, the sources show widespread efforts to evade two main kinds of obligations. The first one is pretty stark: draft evasion, military service.
Understandable, I suppose.
Yeah.
Being a hoplite wasn't exactly safe.
Not at all. It was terrifying, demanding. You could die. So especially for the rich and powerful, using their influence, calling in favors, maybe even outright bribery to avoid being conscripted. It was tempting, it was often possible, and it was a clear case of self-preservation or maybe just fear winning out over civic duty.
Okay, draft dodging. What was the other big area?
Money, financial obligations. These often hit the wealthy the hardest, so that's where you saw a lot of evasion.
Things like liturgies.
Exactly. The liturgies, these were mandatory public services funded out of pocket by the wealthiest citizens on a rotating basis. Things like paying to equip and crew a warship, a trireme, for a year, or funding the training and costumes for a chorus in the dramatic festivals, or financing a religious delegation.
These were expensive but also prestigious, right?
Hmm.
A way to show off your civic virtue.
Hugely visible acts meant to display patriotism and generosity, but they were also a massive financial drain. So the wealthy would constantly try to wriggle out of them. They'd go to court claiming someone else was actually richer and should do it, or they'd try to hide the true extent of their wealth.
And then there were taxes, too.
Yes, the Eisphora. This was an emergency property tax usually levied during wartime. It relied heavily on citizens declaring their own wealth, honestly.
Which sounds optimistic.
Extremely optimistic. It basically opened the door wide for strategic underdeclaration. Choosing the profitable path of keeping your money over the noble path of funding the war effort.
So the whole system, in many ways, relied on a level of civic virtue and trust that was constantly being undermined by self-interest. People chose profit.
They did. And when you take that self-interest and you magnify it onto the political stage, it morphs into dangerous ambition.
Cicero talks about this, doesn't he? How courage, magnanimity can curdle.
Yeah, Cicero makes a great point. He says that a highly magnified spirit, someone naturally brave and ambitious, can easily become corrupted by obstinacy and an excessive longing for preeminence. The desire to be the best, to be number one, isn't inherently bad, but it easily becomes toxic.
Yeah, this is where Plato's critique of existing systems like Sparta really bites. Cicero quotes Plato directly on this point.
He does. Plato apparently noted that all the customs of the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, were inflamed with a longing for conquest. Their whole system was geared towards military dominance and being better than everyone else.
And the consequence of that kind of ambition, whether military or political,
is that it becomes almost impossible to maintain fairness, equity, which Cicero calls the characteristic of true justice. If you're consumed by the desire to beat everyone else, whether on the battlefield or in the political arena,
you'll cut corners?
You'll cut corners, you'll resort to bribery, you'll form factions, you'll engage in dirty politics to gain influence. You start preferring, as Cicero puts it, superiority through force rather than equality through justice.
So Plato's project in the laws wasn't just about writing down rules. It was about designing a whole social and political environment that would actively discourage this lust for preeminence, trying to channel citizens towards shared virtue instead.
That was the immense challenge, he said himself.
Okay, we've looked at the ideals Plato was aiming for: virtue, reason, and the big structural challenges he saw in Sparta and Athens. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty, the actual mechanics of law. How rights were defined, how property was protected, how punishment was actually carried out. This is where the lofty ideals meet the messy reality of social status and economic life.
And Roman law is incredibly useful here. It was such a practical, detailed system, especially when it came to property and commerce. It gives us a clear window into how law actually functions on the ground.
Let's start with property. How did the Romans even think about acquiring property in the first place?
Well, the foundational concept is something called occupancy or occupatio. It's basically the idea that something without an owner belongs to the first person who takes possession of it. Finders keepers, essentially.
Simple enough.
Simple in concept, but incredibly powerful. This basic principle and the rules the Roman jurists developed around it became the root of basically all modern international law regarding things like capture and war, who gets the spoils, and even how nations acquire sovereignty over territory.
Wow. From finders keepers to international law.
And it also supplied the popular theory for how private property originated in the first place. Somebody just claimed it. But beyond origins, Roman law had to get sophisticated about ongoing use, especially land.
Right, because land isn't something you just find once, usually. How did they handle long-term use, like leasing?
They developed some really innovative approaches. Roman municipalities, for instance, started letting out public lands, agrivectigales, on what were effectively perpetual leases at a fixed, often quite low rent.
Perpetual leases. So almost like ownership.
It evolved into something very close. This system eventually became known as emphyteusis. It gave the tenant really strong rights. Full enjoyment of the land, the right to make improvements, even the right to pass the lease on to their heirs. It was a kind of qualified proprietorship, recognized and protected by the praetor, the chief legal officer.
So the law adapted to give security to people who were actually using and improving the land, even if the city technically still owned it.
Exactly. It shows law evolving to support productive economic activity, finding ways to grant secure rights, even when formal civil ownership was complex.
Speaking of formal ownership, Roman civil law, the Appius Civil, Had a reputation for being incredibly rigid, didn't it? Especially about transferring important property.
Oh, notoriously so, particularly for the oldest, most important types of property in their early agricultural society. These were called res mancipi.
What kind of things are res mancipi?
What? Think the absolute essentials. Land in Italy, slaves, oxen, horses, donkeys, basically, the core productive assets. Because they were so vital, transferring ownership required this ancient, very formal public ceremony called mancipation.
Emancipation, what did that involve?
It was quite a ritual. You needed the buyer, the seller, the thing being sold, at least 5 adult male Roman citizen witnesses, plus another guy holding a pair of bronze scales called the liberpins. The buyer would strike the scales with a piece of bronze and recite a set formula claiming ownership.
Okay, that sounds cumbersome. What happened if people just skipped all that? Say, I want to buy your cow, I give you the money, you give me the cow, we shake hands, done. What was the legal situation then?
Under the strict old civil law, a complete mess. Even though you paid and got the cow because you didn't do the emancipation ritual, the seller technically still held the civil law ownership.
So the seller could, in theory, come back later and demand the cow back, even though they'd been paid.
In theory, yes. If the seller was acting in bad faith, they could sue you, the buyer, using a claim based on their retained civil ownership. And under the rigid rules of the civil, the seller would win. The buyer would lose the cow and be out the money.
That seems like a recipe for chaos. How could commerce even function?
It couldn't, effectively, which is why the Roman system developed this brilliant parallel track. The praetor's justice, or equity. The praetor was the magistrate in charge of the courts, and he had the power to issue an edict each year, basically saying how he would apply the law and grant legal remedies.
So the praetor could step in and fix these unfair situations.
Yes. The praetor recognized that sticking to the ancient formalities in every case would destroy trust and cripple business, so he used his authority to introduce fairness, equity. He protected the buyer who had acted in good faith, even without the formal ceremony, in 2 main ways.
Okay, what was the first protection?
The first was a defensive shield. If the seller, who still had civil ownership, tried to sue the buyer to get the property back, the praetor allowed the buyer to raise a special defense called the exceptio rei venditae et traditae, the defense of the thing sold and delivered.
How did that work?
The praetor basically told the judge, look, yes, the civil law says the seller still owns it, but the reality is he sold it, he got paid, he handed it over. It would be unjust to let him get it back. So the defense blocked the seller's lawsuit. Equity trumped rigid law.
Okay, that protects the buyer if the seller tries to cheat them. But what if the buyer lost the cow to someone else, like a thief, before they got around to doing the formal emancipation? They didn't have civil ownership yet, so could they sue the thief?
Under strict civil law, no, they couldn't because they weren't technically the owner, which is also unfair. So the praetor invented an even more ingenious tool, the actio publiciana.
The publishing action. What did that do?
It was what lawyers call a fictitious action. The praetor essentially told the judge, for the purposes of this lawsuit, I want you to pretend, just imagine, that the buyer had actually completed the formal requirements and was the civil law owner.
Whoa, so the judge just acted as if.
Exactly. It was a legal fiction that allowed the buyer, who only had praetorian or bonetary ownership, to sue the third party, like the thief, and get the property back, just as if they were the full civil law owner.
That's incredibly clever. Using a legal fiction to achieve a fair result.
It was revolutionary. It basically created a secure form of ownership based on the transaction itself, not just ancient rituals. It stabilized commerce, protected good faith buyers, and really marks this massive historical shift where practical fairness, administered by the praetor, could legally override the demands of old statutes. It's the birth of equity as a formal legal concept.
Okay, so Roman law could be quite flexible and commercially savvy when it came to property. But now let's shift to the darker side, punishment. Here, it seems like Roman law, especially under the empire, was anything but equal. Status made all the difference for...
All the difference in the world. Justice was absolutely not blind in this respect. By the time of the empire, particularly from the Severan emperors onwards, this dual penalty system was very clear and formalized. It wasn't just custom, it was embedded in the law.
How did it work? Who were the categories?
The law explicitly divided the population into 2 broad classes for punishment purposes, the honestiores and the humiliores.
Honestiores, the more honorable. Who were they?
Basically the upper crust. Senators, equestrians, the knights, veterans, local town councilors, generally people of high social standing and wealth.
And the humiliores.
The more lowly. Pretty much everyone else. The general free population, artisans, laborers, peasants, the poor, the vast majority.
Okay, so same crime, say theft or assault. What's the difference in punishment between an honestior and a humilior?
A world of difference. For an honestior, the death penalty, capite puniri, was extremely rare, usually reserved only for treason or maybe parricide. Their standard serious penalties were things that attacked their status and freedom of movement, but usually not their body.
Like exile.
Exactly. The most common were forms of exile. Deportatio, which meant being banished, usually to an island, losing your citizenship and all your property. Or relegatio, a milder form, banishment, often for a fixed term, but you kept your citizenship and property. They could also face modio ordine, being kicked out of the Senate or their local town council, a social death. But physical violence from the state, very unlikely.
But for the humiliores, the story was completely different.
Completely. They faced the full, terrifying force of state violence, often in public as a deterrent. The most serious penalties were lumped together as the summum supplicium, the highest punishment.
What did that include?
Things like crucifixion, being burned alive, viva sciri, being thrown to wild beasts in the arena, bestia stari. These were fates reserved almost exclusively for the lower classes.
And even short of execution.
They faced brutal alternatives. Life sentences doing hard labor in the mines, ad mitellum, basically a death sentence itself, or forced labor on public building projects, in opus publicum. And crucially, corporal punishment was routine for humiliores.
Beating, flogging?
Yes, beating with rods was common, and flogging or lashing, which was seen as particularly degrading, was also applied. And unlike the upper classes, humiliores, even if they were Roman citizens, were not immune to being tortured to extract confessions or testimony.
Torture. That brings us straight to the status of slaves, doesn't it? Because traditionally, torture was primarily reserved for slaves.
That was the traditional distinction, yes. In classical Athens, for example, you could demand to torture your opponent's slaves for evidence in a lawsuit. It was considered perfectly normal. Free men could still be beaten, maybe with rods, but a proper lashing or whipping was seen as slave treatment. To lash a free man was considered hybris, a terrible insult, an act of outrageous arrogance, precisely because it treated him like a slave.
So the type of physical punishment itself carried a huge social meaning about status.
Absolutely. The line between free and slave was physically marked by vulnerability to certain kinds of violence. Though, as we saw, under the later Roman Empire, that line blurred considerably for the humiliores.
Now, philosophically, how did thinkers grapple with the institution of slavery itself, given its brutality? You mentioned the Stoics earlier.
Right. The Stoics had a really interesting, though perhaps controversial, take on it. They tried to shift the whole focus away from legal status.
Oh.
They argued that the only kind of slavery that truly mattered was moral slavery, being enslaved to your own irrational desires, your passions, your anger, your fear. That, they said, was the real prison. Most people, legally free or not, were living in this state of moral slavery.
So legal slavery, being owned by another person.
Was, in their view, merely an external condition. It affected the body, sure, but it was fundamentally insignificant to your inner self, your reason, your virtue. A true Stoic sage could be perfectly free internally, even while legally enslaved.
That's a powerful intellectual move. Maybe a comforting one if you're a philosopher who owns slaves, perhaps. But it didn't exactly change the slaves' reality on the ground.
No, it certainly didn't change their lack of legal rights or protect them from the whip. However, and this is a crucial point about Rome specifically compared to Greece, that lack of rights for slaves in Rome was often not permanent.
Because of manumission, freeing slaves.
Exactly, and the consequences of manumission in Rome were profound. Unlike in many Greek cities where freed slaves often remained in a kind of halfway status, in Rome, an ex-slave freed by a Roman citizen master almost always received full Roman citizenship automatically.
Full citizenship, just like that.
Pretty much. This created this incredible engine for social mobility that just didn't exist on the same scale elsewhere. Freedmen, liberty, and their descendants became this dynamic, often wealthy, and increasingly influential layer within Roman society.
And they could really climb the social ladder.
Absolutely. We have sources, even speeches in the Senate, openly acknowledging that many members of the equestrian order, the wealthy business class just below the senators, and even some senators themselves, were descended from ex-slaves, maybe just a generation or two back.
That must have had a huge impact on Roman law and society.
Massive. This constant influx of new citizens, many with significant wealth earned after being freed, forced the Roman legal system to be continually flexible. Laws dealing with inheritance, contracts, debt, business partnerships, they all had to adapt to the reality of these powerful freedmen and their families. It created a social fluidity, a degree of churn that was quite unique.
And another complex social reality that Plato, aiming for this perfectly ordered, perhaps more static, virtuous city and the laws, would have had to consider or react against.
Definitely. The Roman experience showed law constantly adapting to social mobility and economic pressure, maybe in ways Plato wouldn't have entirely approved of. Hashtag outrag.
So this deep dive into the legal and constitutional landscape that Plato inherited, it really shows us that when he sat down to write the laws, he wasn't just engaging in abstract philosophical speculation, was he?
Not at all. He was deeply engaged with centuries of real-world political struggle and legal experimentation, with all its successes and, maybe more importantly, its failures.
We saw the intricate balancing act in Sparta, the ephors checking the kings. We saw Athens struggle to move power away from the old aristocracy towards the people. And we saw Rome grappling with how to make law practical, how to use equity to smooth the path for commerce, even while maintaining brutal status distinctions in punishment.
Yeah, and we've really established that ancient law, whether Spartan, Athenian, or Roman, was rarely just a pure expression of some abstract ideal of justice. It was almost always a product of negotiation, a compromise. It reflected the deep social hierarchies, penalties based on who you were, not just what you did. And it often embodied conflicting values, like that tension in Draco's law between religious duty to the dead and the powerful instinct to protect your own family.
So Plato's goal in the laws, this incredibly ambitious attempt to create a system where comprehensive rational laws would actively shape citizens into being virtuous, making them choose the noble path.
It was aiming to overcome all that messy reality.
But the systems we look at, they just keep revealing that deep, seemingly permanent gap between the noble action the community wants and the profitable action the individual often chooses.
That fundamental tension Aristotle pointed out.
Right, that desire to choose what is profitable, it drove people to dodge the draft, to avoid funding public services, to engage in factional politics, constantly undermining the moral fabric the state was trying to weave.
Which brings us, I think, to the final, really provocative thought from all this. If Plato did succeed, on paper at least, in the laws, if he provided this incredibly detailed, comprehensive blueprint for a just society governed by reason, the deeper question still hangs there, doesn't it? Which is, could any legal code, no matter how perfectly designed, truly compel virtue in the long run? We saw how political systems themselves, as Cicero observed, are always vulnerable to those individuals driven by that excessive longing for preeminence.
Those who prefer superiority through force rather than equality through justice.
Exactly. If that drive for personal gain, for power, for profit, can infect not just the ordinary citizen trying to avoid taxes, but also the legislator, the magistrate, the general, then what real hope does even the most brilliantly crafted legal system have? How can it maintain a truly virtuous state against that relentless gravitational pull of self-interest?
That maybe is the ultimate challenge that Plato's final, incredibly practical yet still profoundly idealistic legal project leaves us wrestling with.
I think it is. A question for his time, and maybe still for ours.